Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Michael, you know why I'm excited today to read the second half of Roast Mutton? Do you know why?
Because it's not Rings of Power.
Well, that's exciting every day. This is special today. It's because it's the closest we get to Tolkien actually cussing in a book, I think.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, see? he's on the same line as Game of Thrones at this point with this.
Not quite. He hasn't dropped that low.
No, we are going through the second half of Roast Mutton. It's pretty much all about the trolls in this episode of Exploring Tolkien.
Right.
Sorry, man, I still do that every time I hear myself. Tolkien, Keen, T-O. How does he say Tollkeen? It would be the closest way to the correct pronunciation. But like I said last week, I've been saying Tolkien for far too long for me to still get it through my head. I'm trying, everybody. I'm trying.
Yeah, it's like I have the same issue with Gil-galad. I said Gil-galad my whole life.
Yeah.
And I said like Karis Galadon, and I said I didn't pronounce the TH instead of Calathon with the D, the DH being the TH sound. I didn't get that when I was young, and so I just pronounced it.
Yeah,
there
and then
this names that I just didn't pronounce correctly.
Common one, obviously, in The Hobbit, Smaug.
Yep,
I think
people still say Smaug. Growing up in LA, there was no doubt in my mind the difference
Right.
between Smaug and Smaug.
But they're both evil fire-breathing things that are all around you all the time. That's true.
But one of them was grayer than the other, but yes.
All right. Well, we're going to get into that. But before we do, hey, we will do an extended podcast. And I'm going to have an interesting point of this extended podcast, too, thanks to our supporters like Lynn and Rich and many, many others who give us the $4 a month to get the extended podcast about 15 minutes longer each week. Even last week when we had a shorter episode, we still went about 12 minutes over with our long podcast. So, hey, get the extended podcast, become part of our Discord chat where you can ask questions. We've got a couple from Thomas and from Harrison here. And join us there. I'm sure there'll be a lot of talk about the Rings of Power as it comes out. Actually, there might be no talk about the Rings of Power in the Discord chat since these folks aren't watching it. They're just watching us watch it.
Yep, we're providing a public service.
Yeah.
That's the podcasters like us. There are plenty of others, but they're watching it for the real Tolkien fans, so you all don't have to.
That's right. So if you want to be a real Tolkien fan, like Michael just said, join our Discord chat. Get the extended podcast. Nah, it's totally fine. That's who they are. The real ones. Theonering.com/member, theonering.com/Patreon. Both will work. You get the extended podcast usually a couple days early too, all depending on schedule and editing time. Anyway, all right. So as is our usual want, we do need to get into, do I want to do this first? No, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to talk about how great even the listeners on YouTube are that aren't Premier members, that aren't our members who give us $4 a month. These are wonderful, wonderful folks who, guys, like I said before, like my love of Tolkien is the world. And so for me, like getting into the Silmarillion, getting into the histories of Middle-earth, that's where I really love this. And so sometimes I miss things because I don't know, mentally I focus so much on the world and where things are and how things happen and that, and not so much on some of the intricate details that Tolkien even recalled later in The Lord of the Rings based on The Hobbit. So last week we talked about, where was this thing when it's like, even where they were in places where even they didn't know about the king, right? And so P.W. Miles, 56 on YouTube, he made this point. He said that the not heard of the king is a proverbial saying of the hobbits mentioned in the Lord of the Rings prologue. I'm like, oh, right. So they have little knowledge of the world beyond the Shire, and so it's left open whether the Shire hobbits knew about the Rangers, but even Frodo, who might have first learned about them in Bree, doesn't associate them with the Old Kingdom. So here's the quote directly from the prologue to the Lord of the Rings. And so I checked to see, like, would this prologue have been edited after like in the 1960 edition or 1966 edition? And no, this here came out with the original edition, this prologue concerning hobbits.
Nice.
So he wrote this: there remained, of course, this is Tolkien speaking in Concerning Hobbits, there remained, of course, the ancient tradition concerning the High King of Fornost, or Norbury, as they called it, away north of the Shire. but there had been no king for nearly 1,000 years, and even the ruins of King's Norbury were covered with grass. Yet the hobbits still said of wild folk and wicked things, such as trolls, that they had not heard of the king, for they attributed to the king of old all their essential laws, and usually they kept the laws of free will, because they were the rules, with capital T and capital R, as they said, both ancient and just. So this is probably a little bit of retconning from Tolkien, but it's such a cool way how he just like, oh, well, this whole phrase, because they hadn't heard of the king, he properly stated in a historical fashion in The Lord of the Rings. So my question was answered by who? Tolkien himself. I love it.
It's great.
And PW Miles 56.
But that actually explains to me why I had the inkling last week when we were talking about it, that it was referring to the king of old. I just couldn't remember. I didn't remember that specific quote from the prologue, and it probably just stuck a little bit in my head. Yeah.
And we are going to, I was going to go this week. We're going to do this in our extended edition. We talked about last week about comparing Frodo's and Bilbo's journey to Rivendell, or at least to the bridge of Mythaethel. So the journey from Frodo to Mythaethel and for Bilbo is tough to reconcile. Even Tolkien really couldn't do it. But Karen Fonstad in the Atlas of Middle-earth did try. So in this copy on page 100, we're going to take a look at it and kind of talk about why it doesn't really work. And sometimes you just have to accept that it's just a story Tolkien wrote and he never really reconciled it together. But we're going to talk about that in our extended podcast. Go to theonering.com/member to get that. Okay. Or theonering.com/Patreon. All right. Well, now it's time for our usual look into
Hobbit facts.
Did you know, Michael, that we probably have a 10-year-old to thank for the publication of The Hobbit, perhaps even for knowing Middle-earth in general?
No, did not know.
So Rainer Unwin, the son of Stanley Unwin, who was the publisher of what was it, Unwin and Sons, I think? Well, eventually it was called, I believe. That published The Hobbit, that published The Lord of the Rings in Britain. He was sent the first chapter of The Hobbit, or he was sent The Hobbit, not the first chapter, sorry, I'll get to that point. He was sent the Hobbit, and Stanley Unwin gave it to his son to read. And so he gave it a good review, and his father agreed to publish it. So here's what was written as an intro to a letter to Susan Dagnall by in the letters of J.R.R. Tolkien. They wrote this. It was on October 3rd, 1936, that Tolkien sent the completed typescript, to Allen and Unwin, not Unwin and Son, Allen and Unwin. Stanley Unwin, founder and chairman of the firm, replied on the 5th of October that they would give their immediate and careful consideration to the book. On October 30th, Unwin's son Rainer, age 10, wrote a favorable review of the book, and by the time of the following letter, it had been accepted for publication, and Tolkien was already preparing maps and illustrations. So it sounds like Stanley Unwin and Rainer pretty much through his life. This is what he said. Yeah, he's like, I read The Hobbit, and then my dad kind of agreed to what I said. I said you should publish it. And my dad said okay, and actually similar to The Lord of the Rings, but so we have him to thank for really publishing The Hobbit originally. And then in 1938, after Tolkien had written the first chapter, only a year later after the publication of The Hobbit, he had already written the first chapter of The Lord of the Rings. Rainer Unwin told his father he was, quote, delighted with the first chapter. Oh. And then he didn't like the second and third chapter because there was too much, quote, Hobbit talk. So he wanted more action and less exposition. But yeah, Rainer Unwin to thank for The Hobbit.
That's pretty awesome. That's a great little factoid.
And in fact, if I remember right, for The Lord of the Rings, they had apparently they had a falling out, Stanley Unwin and J.R.R. Tolkien. And so when Unwin got the manuscript, he gave it to his son to read, and his son made the recommendation to publish it, saying it was the work of a, quote, genius, I believe was the word he used.
And this is when he's older now.
This is when he's older. So he would have been 10 at 37. This would be 51, I think it was. So he would have been like 24. And he said it was a work of a genius, but you may lose £1,000 publishing it. And his father still agreed to it. They'll still agreed to publish it. And so Rainer Unwin was quite instrumental in getting these books published.
That's fantastic.
See, 10-year-olds matter, even though I tell them they don't.
I wonder if he ever developed a relationship with Tolkien himself.
They did, yeah. Actually, in as they got older, they had quite the relationship. In fact, another thing I remember is that Rainer Unwin would call him Professor Tolkien, and as he got older, Tolkien was like, "Call me Ronald."
That's something coming from a man of his generation.
So he wanted to be sort of on equal footing with him, and I think they had a very good, just a friendly relationship. I think was it 73 he died, so in 72 or 73 they had a big event for him. I can't remember what that was, where Rainer Unwin helped set it up, everything like that. He passed away in, I want to say it was right around 2000, something like that. Okay. But yeah, so funny how a 10-year-old then, I mean, like Christopher Tolkien, his whole life was sort of revolving around Tolkien for so many years because of all the publishing and everything going on with that, and how he was instrumental in seeing it published. Kind of crazy.
That's fantastic.
All right, so let us get into Chapter 5 of The Hobbit, Episode 6 of us reading through The Hobbit. This is the last half of Roast Mutton. Now, last week, we ended on the point at which they see... Sorry, let me get that right. The point at which they see the fire, and we get to know the trolls. And one thing, just to preface this, one thing that I had the pleasure of doing is, I didn't realize this, and I don't know if this is the upgraded version of The Hobbit on Kindle, is they actually have Tolkien reading a large part of Roast Mutton with the trolls. And I couldn't find it online anywhere. So I'm going to see if I can get it next week. If I can, I'll just take the audio out and just do a straight record, and then see if we can, we'll get into that in our next episode of this. But it's a wonderful reading of this. So I will say, like, each week I try to take one thing away. We used to have Dan's big thought. This is Jonathan's minor muse. What I realized here is it's very interesting that Tolkien kind of sets up the dwarves as a little bit incompetent, a little bit incapable. Like they're not very good at this journeying in dangers kind of thing.
Right. They're much sillier than the dwarves might eventually become in definitely in Lord of the Rings, but in the dwarves of the final chapters of The Hobbit are different from the dwarves of the first couple chapters of The Hobbit. I would venture to say this is a true thing. The dwarves of war decked out. I was thinking about this episode when the dwarves come in and Thorin puts up a fight against the trolls. He has to grab a branch from the fire. In other words, he doesn't. They don't even bring weapons with them. And they're going to go. He's going to fight trolls. I mean, and they get caught in bags, and it's very slapstick. It's very vaudeville, sort of almost like a black and white old silent movie or something like that. I could see that whole scene being put to a pretty funny silent movie from the 20s and 1920s, that is. And so then I think of the dwarves of the final chapters in the Battle of the Five Armies, and we have a quite different take on them, I think. So
totally different.
We'll talk about more when we get there.
What's interesting is though the dwarves change, Bilbo is still the same. Mm-hmm. Really much the same character throughout the books, which is maybe another whole episode about how he's not such a dynamic character in the end.
No, he isn't. No, he's not dynamic at all. There's a few changes, but they're not. He really is the same person, which is fascinating because he's said to be the one that changed the most. And but in truth, in the literature itself, I think it's the dwarves that changed the most from the beginning of the book. Gandalf doesn't change much, but the dwarves definitely do.
Yeah. So it's his courage is put on display here really for the first time. Like not courage like I'm going to go on an adventure kind of courage. I'm going to sign this contract or not even sign the contract. Just go. Not that was courage necessarily, but here he decides to to pickpocket. He becomes a pickpocket, not a real burglar in the truest sense of the word. And it's funny to me. I don't know if I ever caught this. It's the wallet, the purse talks. It actually says something, and I read through that quickly, and I was thought like, oh, it's one of the stone trolls. No, it says, "Here, who are you?" It squeaked as it left the pocket, and William turned around at once and grabbed Bilbo by the neck. And so I never really caught the whole thing that we have foxes thinking, but we also have purses talking. What is going on? I mean, sure, we have swords speaking in the Silmarillion, but a wallet. It's
well, it is. It's very fairy tale-ish. It's also very Dungeons and Dragons-ish. You got talking pouches. So but what I find, or rather, what I should say is Dungeons and Dragons. Like, this isn't the only this paragraph about what Bilbo does when he sees the trolls has actually Dungeons and Dragons takes a lot from this passage, and I read first. We're told what he ought to have done. After hearing all this, Bilbo ought to have done something at once. Either he should have gone back quietly and warned his friends that there were 3 fair-sized trolls at hand in a nasty mood, quite likely to try a roasted dwarf or even pony for a change, or else he should have done a bit of good, quick burgling. And by the way, Tolkien loves playing with the word burgle in this. Like he keeps talking about using that word in various forms. So first it's burgling. A really first-class and legendary burglar would at this point have picked the troll's pockets. It is nearly always worthwhile if you can manage it. Pinched the very mutton off the spits, purloined the beer, and walked off without their noticing him. Okay, so we're given like the heights of what of a legendary burglar, and then we're saying others more practical but with less professional pride would perhaps have stuck a dagger into each of them before they observed it. Like, this is classic D&D backstabbing. So if you're not good enough. For a really good thief will do it. And I'm reminded of the fact that thief was, like, as a class in Dungeons and Dragons, is a concept that didn't exist. Like, Tolkien made this up. Like, Bilbo is a burglar. Tolkien wasn't imagining role-playing games, but he made up the idea that you could be a burglar as a class of a thing, and it isn't just someone who goes into people's homes to steal stuff at night. You can even be a legendary burglar, as he says in this thing. And then if you're not or you can backstab. Then the night could have been spent cheerily. Bilbo knew it. He had read a good many things he had never seen or done. He was very much alarmed, as well as disgusted. He wished himself 100 miles away, and yet somehow he could not go straight back to Thorn and Company empty-handed. So he stood and hesitated in the shadows. Of the various burglarious, which is a word that no one ever uses.
That's my favorite word in the whole chapter.
The word for this chapter is burglarious. Of the various burglarious proceedings he had heard of, picking the troll's pocket seemed the least difficult, so at last he crept behind a tree just behind William. And then what proceeded, it was what you described, which is he successfully gets the pouch out, but then the pouch outs him by talking and saying, and the pouch itself has an accent, which I have to say, that brings me to my most fun that I had preparing for this podcast, which was the great debate. Apparently there was one which I was not aware of, between what kind of accent do the trolls actually have per the text. Now, I don't think that people had the benefit of hearing Tolkien's reading of it. And that was exactly my position. So before, as I prepared for tonight, I'd have to say, dear listeners, I did not actually, I formed an opinion about what kind of accent this would be. And listening to the arguments folks have had about it, and pulling up bulletin boards and going through the text over and over again, the different versions, the manuscript version of the text and from 1937 version, and then the 1966 version. And so what I keep it, like, if you ask ChatGPT, it'll tell you it's a Cockney accent, because ChatGPT is the summation of the most average things that human beings believe about a particular topic.
I'm going to have to name that ChatGPT utterly average.
That's right.
That's what it is.
Disturbingly average, in fact. So, but as it turns out, when you're looking at it, so I always read it when in my head and in my words when I was reading to my kids as a kind of Cockney accent, which is it's a London accent. It's an urban London accent, and probably from a famous person perspective for much of our audience, if you've ever seen a Jason Statham movie. Jason Statham is a English action star, famously bald head. At least he's had a bald head for many years. But he has a Cockney accent. And so it's this urban accent, which does these things like drops H's from the fronts of words, and it elongates the ah sound. And it has the glottal T where it misses out the T in the middle of words. So instead of water, which, proper English pronunciation, Americans say water with a D, and English say water or water. They drop the R at the end for an a very soft R sound, and they pronounce the T. The Cockney is water, but the West Country accent. Now, West Country, what's West Country? Which is what I think the trolls were. And the West Country is sort of Bristol, Cornwall. And if you look at a picture of England, it's everything in the peninsula of England in the southwest that's sticking out, pointing towards America. So that portion of England sticks out and points west into the Atlantic Ocean. That's all West Country. So those accents. Now, West Country accents, my wife tells me Poldark has West Country accents. It's a show that a lot of her friends like, and I've watched like 2 episodes of. I couldn't take it anymore. So West Country accents, what they do is they have a rhotic R. Yeah, so West Country is everything in that bit sticking out bottom left of England. That's the West Country. And so there's a lot of farmers there, a lot of farmland in the West Country. It's famous for its farmland. And so their accent is a very rural accent. And this makes more sense for the trolls because the trolls are these kind of country bumpkins. It makes less sense for Tolkien to have given them an urban accent, and more a rural accent would have been more appropriate. The West Country accent does do things that the Cockney accent does. So it does drop the H from the beginning of the words occasionally. So in Tolkien's Hobbit, in one of the first sentences, one of the first paragraphs, what the hell, William, was it thinking of?
There it is.
Into these parts. Yeah, but notice, so 2 things are happening. The West Country accent pronounces the R's. It is very unusual amongst British accents. So instead of saying first for first, or farm for farm, they say first and farm, and they have the kind of that lilt to it too. Painter. That's a West Country accent. It's the British farmland. So in the very first sentence we hear from them, mutton yesterday, mutton's day, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow. In the West Country accent, and by the way, this is going to be all of our listeners, please feel free to mock me. I'm terrible at accents, but this is definitely, you got to give it that sort of country twang, farmland thing. That's probably what Tolkien was aiming for. And it would be something like, mutton yesterday, mutton today, and blimey if it don't look like mutton again tomorrow, said one of the trolls. So I exaggerated it, but that accent is, they definitely pronounce, they don't say tomorrow, they like a Cockney accent would, they say tomorrow. They actually pronounce their R's very strongly. So again, like farm and lover and painter, but they have this kind of lilting, and instead of saying, and their UIs like guide, they'll say guide. That's a West Country accent. So, and then the biggest giveaway here is the West Country drops the G from the ing sound. So they do things like running short, and the drink running short. What's more? I'm reading from Tolkien there. That's William. And so, what the hell, William, was it thinking to bring us into these parts all here? Parts at all beats me, and the drink running short. What's more? He said. So that was my guess. And then Jonathan kindly, right before we started recording, gave me the recording to listen to. And Tolkien, although Tolkien's doing he has a sort of proper Oxford accent, proper British accent, with a little bit of West Midlands thrown in. he in fact does pronounce his R's and does drop the G from the ing sound, and very much sounds to me like West Midlands. So there you go, West Country rather. So the West Country accent, as I think what the trolls are in, and this would have been very funny. I was amused to hear in the annotated Hobbit it said that of all the chapters in the Hobbit, this one was the favorite, apparently the universal favorite of all of Tolkien's children.
Yep.
And you can't help but think, as did other, and this is not new from me, it's just other authors have commented on the same thing. You can't help but think that Tolkien is throwing in these sort of country bumpkin trolls, and they're highly amusing to his children, because it's like people doing, deep South accents or strong Texan accents or something around here in America. So which is, it's a slower sort of more. It has more R's. It has more. It just sounds. It's a funny accent to many people, especially Tolkien. Remember, is raising his kids in Oxfordshire, and they're amongst a little bit more of the elite class.
Yeah, Michael Tolkien. He said this. We thought there was something rather nice about the trolls, and it was a pity. It was a pity they had to be turned to stone at all. And I think next week when I get this here, if I can, I should be able to get it off my phone. I think listening to him speak and imagining your father taking on these characters, I think that was part of the wonderful nature of this chapter to them, because he was probably getting into those characters more so than any other character. I mean, you can't really get into the character of Elrond and be like, oh, I love Elrond so much. You're like, no, these trolls, they have such personality, such character, such bad manners. And so
exactly. And what's funny is when the trolls make their return in Lord of the Rings, which is as stone statues that Aragorn and the hobbits walk by and they come upon, then Sam sings a song, which it's itself is a kind of a callback. It's this Fox Went Out on a Chilly Night. It was sung to the tune of that, but about the old troll and Tom. And
that's right, yeah.
And it kind of brings back that whole character of like the callback to this sort of rural bumpkin troll, like the troll in that and Tom in that poem that Sam sings are sort of characters out of the Hobbit almost. They're not as much characters unless they're related to Tom Bombadil. They're not characters from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, and they occupy this interesting space between being horribly dangerous and bad-mannered and goofy.
Right.
And so I'm going to read this chat. We're right after actually what you read. And they're talking about there's no man flesh, and there's they can't get the food, and so William Tolkien writes this. William choked. "Shut your mouth," he said as soon as he could. "You can't expect folk to stop here forever just to be et by you and Bert. You've had a village and a half between you since we come down from the mountains. How much more do you want? And time's been up our way. When you're to have said, thank your bill for a nice bit of fat valley mutton like what this is." He took a big bite off a sheep's leg he was roasting and wiped his lips on his sleeve. "Yes, I'm afraid trolls do behave like that, even those with only one head each." And I'm like, they eat people, they've eaten entire villages, and what's the worst thing they can do is wipe their lips on their sleeve. And then later we find out at the end of the chapter is like, why did Gandalf come back? Because the elves were afraid of the trolls and they were so concerned, and he found out about them. And but listening to the trolls, you're never really scared, right? They don't come across. It's a little more, Humpty Dumpty kind of.
Well, it is, and the Gandalf-induced ventriloquism, where they're arguing with each other and their own arguments with each other before Gandalf arrives. I mean, it's almost like the Three Stooges, but the kind that want to kill you, I guess, and eat you. So it really is
Larry, Moe, Curly, and death.
It really is very much slapstick and combined with this sort of dangerous fairy tale element, which, by the way, is an element of fairy. In fairy, there's a tremendous amount of humor juxtaposed with terrible danger at the same moment. Sort of odd things that come up, which are at once both charming and terrifying. So it has that character of the fairy story in this regard. And you got the talking pouch, which was never explained.
Yeah.
So it's great. I mean, what's funny is the pouch talks, but I suppose the pouch, it would have been dropped because Bilbo pulled it out. So it wouldn't have been turned to stone. Maybe they put it back in their pocket and it got turned to stone. But there's so many elements of this story which, when measured against the sort of gritty realism that Lord of the Rings kind of brings to things, don't match up. This is clearly a children's story. In that sense, it doesn't surprise me that Tolkien's children themselves loved it more than the other stories. But you have a lot of funny situations. I mean, you think about that the argument between the trolls, which is actually Gandalf pretending to be trolls to keep them distracted until sunrise, right, when they turn to stone. Yeah. That doesn't work except for a story. So if you have three trolls sitting and staring at each other, and then two of them say something, and then the third one, but it's really Gandalf in that third one's voice, says something, you're not going to fool them because they're looking at the third guy. They're looking at William, and his mouth isn't moving. So it's not like that Gandalf's ventriloquism is actually going to work. It only works because this is literary dialogue, where it's the back and forth, the quick firing dialogue, which is funny and slapstick, but only works in a book. So it lacks the realism of a truly sort of imagined scene that has the secondary world quality, but it is still entertaining nonetheless.
I was entertained, but while I was reading it this time, I'm like, these aren't. They're not friendly, but yet they are. I'm trying to, and what I did is I tried to think of other characters. Are there any other characters that are like this in what we've read of Tolkien? Like where do these characters come from? So two things from that. One is I don't think there are. Like I was thinking maybe Gollum at certain points has sort of, like, you have pity for him more than anything else, but that would be the closest. But really what it shows is like in the trolls are, and this comes from notes both in the annotated Hobbit and in the history of the Hobbit, in that what Tolkien wrote was what he knew. And we read in On Fairy Stories that he would go through all the different, with the Andrew Lang, was that
yes,
the green right. Green book, the red book,
the books of fairies, the
books of fairies, and then also Grimm's he knew. And so for instance, different parts of it are all inspired from different stories that he knew. So for instance, how he approaches the three trolls is reminiscent of a Grimm's fairy tale called the expert huntsman. I don't think I need to read that, but just it's very similar to that. The trolls turning to stone is essentially from Icelandic folklore. So
right, which he had heard in an essay a few years before, in 1926.
That's right.
Someone gave an essay at Oxford about it.
Yep. And then Gandalf's trickery in as he casts his voice is similar to something called the Brave Little Tailor, which is also in Grimm's fairy tales, where I guess it's like somebody's throwing stones at the other person, and each person thinks like the other person is throwing the stones, and they get mad at each other and end up fighting. So but it's interesting because Tolkien wrote what he knew, and it's these little stories that percolate, just like we learned last week that he had Beren and Luthien in it. And so the Hobbit is really an amalgamation of so much of these things in here, more so than anything even in the Silmarillion. At least to me, that's what it senses.
Yes, I agree. And I'm glad you brought out the Grimms, because that kind of fairy story is very reminiscent of the Grimms, where you have terrible creatures that want to kill you that are also have this aspect of whimsy and silliness to them. I mean, even the witch that in Hansel and Gretel that wants to bake it, like her house is made of gingerbread.
Right. Yeah.
It's just there's this strangeness to it which doesn't fit reality, but which fits the imagination of a child. A minor element of this is that just doesn't make sense. Trolls have keys. Like, where's the troll key maker? So they have key. You can't open the door of their lair except with the right key, which Bilbo luckily finds. But imagine what has to occur for trolls to be like, send away for a key for our lair that we've just set up and established. And because we don't want anyone going into our home without us. And the best way to do that is not like put a massive boulder that nothing could lift except us in front of it. No, it's keys
and a door. Okay.
And hilariously, this is the first time I've caught this when I was reading this. I've read this so many times, and it's the first time I caught it. And it's because I just was listening to a podcast on the Fellowship of the Ring, and they were talking about Gandalf, in front of the doors of Moria, and hilariously, he says he knows like 200 opening spells, and he tries them all, and they don't work at the doors of Moria. Here, Gandalf also sits there in front of this locked door and tries all these failed opening spells, and they don't work. So apparently, none of Gandalf's spells, like the only 2 times that Gandalf's magic that were shown, Gandalf's door opening magic or door closing magic, there are actually 3 times. Gandalf tries to open or close doors with magic 3 times in Lord of the Rings, once in The Hobbit, twice in Lord of the Rings, rather, in the Legendarium, I should say. Mm-hmm. And all 3 times he fails. He fails to open the troll cave with magic, he fails to open the doors of Moria with magic, and he fails to close the door in Moria against the Balrog. So there's to hold the door, I should say, with magic. And so it's Gandalf imagines himself more proficient than he perhaps is with opening and closing magic with doors. But that's the conclusion I'm coming to from Tolkien.
Man, he's such an incompetent wizard. Competent dwarves, wizards can't do anything. I just love that Bilbo is like, hey, what about this key I found?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, wait, what? It's like the standard, like, you've been holding the key the whole time, you didn't mention it?
You could have told us about this earlier. Yeah, exactly. And again, more comedy than anything else. But then again, here's the not comedy part. What do they find inside the troll cave, among other things? Glamdring and Orcrist, first age swords of great power from Gondolin. And so what does that mean? These 3 trolls ate like 2 elf lords at least. So this is a massive switch. And then Gandalf, it says, although I was interested to find out the 1937 version, he does not talk about meeting the people of Rivendell. He just said that he got worried for them. He was out on the road and he got worried for them and returned. And he said he found out that there were trolls in the area. He doesn't say how in the early version. But in the 1966 version, it says he met elves from Rivendell, travelers from Rivendell, he says, which are almost definitely elves, and that they were scared of the trolls rather. And so, that they had been preying on travelers. And so Gandalf rushes back just in the nick of time. But what a switch, right? In The Hobbit, we have 3 bumbling trolls that are nevertheless terrible enough to have killed a couple of major elf lords. And then we switch to, or I guess another way of putting it is you have a situation where in Rivendell travelers are scared of trolls in The Hobbit, and versus Rivendell travelers scaring Nazgul in Lord of the Rings. Like Glorfindel, who's an elf lord from Gondolin, is like 5 ringwraiths ran from him. So there's a massive tonal switch, and it shows Tolkien's development of characters between the 2, and the elves, of course, become something much more in the Lord of the Rings than they are here in The Hobbit. So, but anyway,
I don't think they're even travelers from Rivendell, because the way he puts it, he says Elrond's people, which means elves. It's not a ranger.
Right.
I think it's definitely the elves that come.
Yep, you're right. Yeah, it can't even be the occasional other traveler in Rivendell or rangers. Yeah. It's Elrond's people. So you got elves scared of 3 trolls versus and who can defeat elf lords apparently, because they got the weaponry to prove it, and versus Nazgul being scared of elf lords in Lord of the Rings. So there's a real shift, a narrative shift here, and we definitely are dealing with the child story in this version. We haven't made that shift. I think that shift happens. I think it happens, and we'll talk more about the changing tone as we go through each chapter.
Well,
but I think we're in Roast Mutton. We're still firmly in a child's tale.
I think. Well, Tolkien had regrets about that, and in the annotated Hobbit, one of the marks in here, it quotes Tolkien from an interviewer when he was speaking to an interviewer in 1967, and he commented this about the tone, the style of The Hobbit. The Hobbit was written in what I should now regard as bad style, as if one were talking to children. There's nothing my children loathed more. They taught me a lesson. Anything that in any way marked out The Hobbit as for children instead of just for people, they disliked instinctively. I did too. Now I think about it. All this I won't tell you anymore, or all this I won't tell you anymore. You think about it stuff. Oh no, they loathe it. It's awful. Children aren't a class. They're merely human beings at different differing stages of maturity. So this goes, I think C.S. Lewis has a quote about how never write down to children, because you want to raise them up a little bit, right? You don't want to use silly little dumb words. And so even when, like I say this is a funny thing, because even when my kids were little, I tried not to speak to them like as little baby children all the time. And so I would use big words and they'd be like, huh? I'm like, well, let me explain that word to you. And even now I will try to, they're older now. My youngest is 8, my oldest is 14. But I try to speak to them not as children, but as little adults, and say, like, you can understand the stuff mentioned. I think upward, that's probably where, when Tolkien was rewriting this in 1960, trying to split that difference between a charming story that isn't childlike and an adult tale based out of Middle-earth that feels like Lord of the Rings was probably mentally a very difficult hurdle to jump. Right. It's really tough. And so I haven't read it yet because I want to do it completely fresh, but I know the rewritten second chapter that we have in the History of the Hobbit book, which I'll put a link below if you guys want to try and get it. It might take 5 weeks to get to you like it did for Michael, but you can get it. It's the only place you can get the entire rewritten chapters he has. Apparently the second rewritten chapter is the most dramatically changed. And so I'm going to be really curious where Tolkien tried to take it in 1960 when he rewrote Roast Mutton and called it The Lost Bridge, The Broken Bridge. I don't have it in front of me. One of those two names. Yep. Yeah. So really interesting. I love the trolls, but they don't frighten me at all. And I'm curious to see if next week they will be more frightening at all.
Right. Yep. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see. So
yeah. Let's see. I think that covers all the things I wanted to look at. Michael, do you have anything else that you thought was worth bringing up in this chapter?
No. I think it's great. I think it's great. I do find, like, it's one of those elements of a children's story or a fun fairy tale is there's always treasure. And in this chapter, Tolkien brings his first treasure out, right? They get a ton of gold that they then hide, and so they're presumably there's some kind of map in their memories or something to where they buried the treasure. So they go and bury treasure literally, and so no one else can find it. So to me, I remember reading it when I was a kid and thinking that was awesome, and I was so happy when spoiler alert, they find the treasure again at the end. Yeah, it's only been what 87 years since he wrote The Hobbit. So if you haven't figured it out by now,
time's up. Time's up, people. I mean, I can forgive you if you haven't sat through the films, but you can read the book in half the time. So,
and by the way, let me just say that quickly, because I don't like the films at all. And this part, like, this is one of they leaned into the gross humor and the stupid humor, and they took away in the movies, in the Hobbit movie, they take away Bilbo's best joke. Like, Tolkien is actually writing good wordplay and jokes, and so when they first capture Bilbo and they say, let's see, what I say, said Bilbo, gasping. Oh, they don't even do the Burrow Hobbit. They in the movie
they
do something. No, they do something else. They do another play. Anyway, it isn't. So they don't do the Burrow Hobbit, and then Bilbo says, gasping, "And please don't cook me, kind sirs. I am a good cook myself, and cook better than I cook. If you see what I mean."
Yeah, right. They
take that part out. Like, there's some great stuff that Tolkien had. They just take out and they substitute it for fart jokes and other stupid stuff.
They could have at least gone into like gore and had the jelly, right?
Exactly.
Like that's essentially squeezing somebody into jelly, essentially like popping them out and mixing all their guts together. Could have gone into that. Would have been fun.
That'd be much more grim fairy tales.
You know what it is like? Thinking about like the change between this, I think Tolkien just had more fun with the wordplay in this here. Maybe he felt more free to write that kind of wordplay, because this is not the kind of thing you find in the Silmarillion at all, or anything in the histories of Middle Earth. And I love probably my favorite line, other than Tolkien swearing with L earlier. It's not really swearing. Is when Thorin asks,
better tell our readers what you're talking about.
Oh, well, you mentioned it. You mean the
what the
what the L?
What the L?
Yeah. So,
there's what's considered minor swearing, lumi. Lumi, if I know, what are your and that's Lord Love Me, which was considered a minor swear in the old accents medieval work speak. But anyway,
this is my favorite little word interplay that I don't even remember. Like I said, I've only seen the movies twice, and I'm like occasionally looking at them here while we're going through this here. But this line here, when Thorin asks Gandalf, "Where'd you go?" and Tolkien writes this: "Where did you go, if I may ask?" said Thorin to Gandalf as they rode along. "To look ahead," said he. "And what brought you back in the nick of time?" "Looking behind," said he. I'm like, oh, I love that. So, I don't have the time for you, but it was important, right? It's like,
it's so Gandalf.
yeah. I just love how these wordplays, like, it creates that character, and I think Ian McKellen still inhabited that character incredibly well. You can see him playing these lines perfectly. Were they in The Hobbit? I don't remember, and I don't really care because they're in the book.
Ian McKellen is the most dangerous of all the casting choices because he most completely has substituted himself in my mind's eye when I read The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, where I see Ian McKellen more than any other character in each of these roles.
Agreed.
Sam too, a little bit, but mostly Ian McKellen. And so anyway, that's I agree with you. I love that about Gandalf. It's like Gandalf, he even when he has literally nothing else to do, he makes it sound like he's got anything else to do than answer your question. I've got so many better things to do.
He just doesn't have time.
And you literally have nothing else to do. You're riding on a horse next to him.
or when you're on the horse with him and you ask him questions and he's like, I'm like, what does he say to
Pippin?
To Pippin when he's on Shadowfax going to Gondor to Minas Tirith? I can't remember the line because Pippin keeps asking him questions and anyway.
Yeah, he makes some Gandalf makes some exasperated joke about having to answer his questions. Like, what are you doing? You have literally nothing else to do while Shadowfax runs.
Exactly. You're like, what am I supposed to do? You're sitting here and be quiet the whole time? My butt hurts. Like, let's at least get my mind off that. Jeez.
Gandalf. But it's so cool to see that this is Gandalf. Like all of the things that did change, Gandalf wasn't one of them. I mean, he did change somewhat. Bloodorthin for one, but the character, his character, and the way he's sort of snaps back and always has something better to be doing than whatever it is you want him to talk about.
Yeah. That'd be fun video, awesome. Like Impatient Gandalf. Take all the clips of Impatient Gandalf, right? And movie and be like, he's kind of a jerk. All right, and we love it. I'm here for it. In our extended podcast, which we're going to get into, we're going to talk about. I don't know. Let me see if I can see that. Hold on. Let me get this up here. So there's this the Atlas of Middle Earth, where the comparison between how long it took Frodo and how long it took Bilbo to get to Rivendell from Bag End. It took Thorin and company 38 days to get to Rivendell. Essentially, it's not exact, but they kind of have to and I'll read why in an extended podcast why that is. 38 days. They averaged 10.7 miles per day. Frodo went 28 days and averaged 17.5 miles a day. Well, okay, you say, well, maybe they're going slowly. Haha. However, Bilbo and the dwarves were on ponies for most of the way. And so they were going slower, almost half as slow, or 70% slower than 40% slower than than Frodo and company. And Frodo and company were on foot. Maybe they didn't have a ranger after Bree to push them along.
Gotcha, Tolkien. Gotcha.
To Tolkien, it didn't really matter as much as to us, apparently. So anyway, let's talk about that in the extended podcast. Michael, we'll see you on the other side.
Take care, freeloaders.